Good morning, everybody. My name's Amy Shaw. I'm the Director of Development at IPA. Thanks so much for coming this morning to Evidence Matters. For those of you who may be new to the organization, I wanted to just give a brief introduction to who we are and why you may be here, what you'll hear about today. Innovations for Poverty Action, our mission is to discover and promote effective solutions to global poverty problems. And we do that in a number of ways, primarily by bringing together researchers and funders and government partners and donors and implementing partners all together to test what works best in poverty alleviation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Don Green and Jeannie Annan, who are going to speak to you today about our work with IPV. And we will have time at the end for questions, but also during the presentation, if you have a burning question, please do raise your hand and we'll make this more of a conversation than a seminar. So thanks again very much for coming this morning. Enjoy the program.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to start us off. I'm Jeannie Annan. I'm the Senior Director of Research and Evaluation at the International Rescue Committee. And this is the IPV initiative. The acronyms are terrible, by the way, IPA and IPV. So I may get them wrong occasionally. But so IRC, the International Rescue Committee, where I work, collaborates on this initiative on intimate partner violence with IPA. So I wanted to talk about the overall initiative and what we're trying to do, but I wanted to start just by possibly an obvious point, but the scope of the problem or the scale of the problem of intimate partner violence, why focus on intimate partner violence. So just starting with prevalence, so this is not intimate partner violence, but rather violence against women globally. The problem is enormous, so one in three women across the globe, and certainly there are differences, but across the globe, experience some form of violence in their lifetime, emotional, physical, or sexual. And intimate partner violence is the most common form of violence against women. So the way that I actually came to research this topic and to be interested in focusing on intimate partner violence was actually early on doing interviews in northern Uganda with young women who had escaped from the Lord's Resistance Army. So my focus of my work and the IRC's work is actually in conflict-affected and disaster-affected settings. So I was interviewing many, and the focus of the study was actually looking at child soldiering, and truly in this area, some of the worst forms of violations against humanity that one can experience or witness. And I was interviewing young women who had escaped the Lord's Resistance Army and hearing about their experiences and how they were coping with current daily life. And one of the issues that kept coming up was intimate partner violence. So they were out of this, they had escaped the horrors of this armed group and were now in relationships where they are being emotionally, physically, sexually abused by their partners. So that was sort of my coming to this field and focusing then on the dual burden that women face in conflict-affected settings of both conflict and armed violence, but also intimate partner violence. And then that's proven to be true in the IRC's programming, where a lot of women who are coming forward for response services actually end up coming forward because of intimate partner violence. So just to give a sense of how I ended up focusing here, but the state of violence in IPV. Probably, again, another obvious point, but the impacts of violence on women and intimate partner violence are enormous. So that these are some of the health impacts in terms of mental health, so women being twice as likely to experience depression, being 16% more likely to have a low birth weight baby, so there are intergenerational effects, and more likely to have injuries, and some of these, the partner violence ends up in death. So this initiative aimed to focus on this enormous problem. Sorry, I'm standing in your way over here. And really to increase the evidence to prevent IPV by doing three things. So to focus first on designing innovative and scalable ideas and rigorously evaluating their impact. And then to do that in part by bringing not only the rigorous evidence, which is part of the bread and butter of what IPA does, but also bring human-centered design or user-centered design to the design to the thinking, use design thinking in the development of these IPV interventions, so sort of marrying the rigorous evidence with the design thinking approach. And then third, to broaden the type of research and researchers that focus on intimate partner violence by through a research fund, and I'll talk about briefly the different ways we've done this. And the three of these are really responding to two things. One is a lack of evidence in general on IPV. So it's a relatively new field in a sense compared to, say, development economics. So it is, new in terms of rigorously testing evaluations that prevent IPV. So there are only a handful of rigorous evaluations. That's changing, and every year there are more. But this initiative was to try to address that dearth of evidence in the area, and also to really push on innovation. So many of the interventions that have taken place to prevent violence are sort of incremental derivatives of each other, which is not a bad thing. It's great to replicate and to try to scale things that where there are programs. So it was trying to push the innovation in this area as well. So I'll talk about what we did on these first two, so designing innovative and scalable ideas and using human-centered design. And again, just the way we were trying to think about this is, what do we know from the evidence base about what works to prevent intimate partner violence? But what do we also know about behavior change, evidence from other areas, and how do we draw on that? But then how do we focus on the users and really do iterative, more rapid learning and user testing of prototypes or ideas that come out of both the evidence base, but also what users are saying, and then how do we draw on analogous experiences, pull from other fields that might inspire ideas, and bring those together. And so here's what we did. We launched what ended up being a 5-month process. In Liberia is where we started. We ended in Liberia and Uganda to identify promising ideas for products, services, systemic innovations to prevent IPV. We really were pretty open in terms of the ideas, and really doing a lot of interviews and scoping with both men and women. We and came up with many, even tens of ideas. We moved 3 of these ideas after sort of whittling them down forward, after assessing them against criteria, basically looking at what's their potential for impact, their potential for scale, and cost effectiveness. And then did extensive prototyping and piloting to evaluate the feasibility of 2 of these ideas. I'll talk about one and then just mention the other. And then after piloting and prototyping and tweaking these interventions, then moved 2 of these to impact evaluations, 2 RCTs that we're now conducting in Uganda and Liberia. So I wanted to mention one of these that moved to an RCT called Becoming One. This is a skills-based couples counseling curriculum for use with faith leaders to strengthen relationships in couples and to reduce or prevent intimate partner violence. And these are just some of the materials that have been produced for both the couples to use themselves and for the faith leaders. Why did we end up here? This really was through this sort of user feedback. Neither IPA, which I'm sure you know, nor IRC are a faith-based organization. The intention was not actually to work with faith leaders, but the feedback over and over was that along with some others, faith leaders and biblical principles in this case, were places that couples, both men and women, looked to both set the tone for their relationship, where they go for crisis. And so working with faith leaders seemed an important way to do that, but also pulling in the evidence about building skills around communication, conflict resolution, goal setting in finances together, sexual agency and sexual consent for women. And so this is, it was really through the interviews with men and women that we came up with both the sort of delivery and what the actual skills were. So it's delivered through premarital and marriage counseling classes conducted in churches, and then an initial testing of this with about 500 couples. We didn't do interviews with all 500 couples, but ran the program with about 500 couples in Uganda. And a lot of the feedback was that this actually helped them from their perspective to improve their relationship, to improve financial transparency between them, which is an issue, sexual agency, again, for women. And that framing relationship skills in these biblical principles was really helpful in motivating both men and women in this intervention. Yeah.
Would you guys trust that kind of self-reported feedback? I mean, they know what you want them to say, and so they'll say, yes, it's helpful that you did this thing, because they feel impolite not doing that.
Right. So that's part of why we move it into an RCT, which is what we're doing now. But it does bring up an issue. So in this field, getting beyond self-report is really challenging. So we do ask both men and women. So these were qualitative interviews. They were pretty open about trying to ask them for actual feedback to improve the program. So what are ways that we could improve this? And so trying to, in a sense, lead away from giving positive feedback, but still it's self-report. In the surveys that we've moved it into an RCT, and we ask the questions in multiple different ways. We usually ask the questions on violence only to the woman, and not to the man, and so there's less bias there in terms of the need to sort of report decreased violence. So we think a lot about these measurement issues. It's a real challenge in this field in terms of there aren't sort of clear observational methods that can be done. But yes, so the first one was just, I would frame it as perceptions and feedback in terms of the pilot, and now moving, what we've just done now, we finished the baseline for, it's actually just under 2,000 couples this fall, and the program just last week actually launched. And so we'll do the program and then do an end line and a further follow-up next year and have findings on this. So that's, and the other one, sorry, I'd meant to put in a slide on this. The other one that I'll just mention, and happy to answer questions about it, and there are others in here who can also answer questions about it, but we also started what we call the Modern Man Challenge in Liberia, and that's quite a different approach, and this is an SMS, it's a SMS messaging intervention that starts actually in video halls or tea clubs, coffee houses, bars, engaging men where they are, doing a quiz around relationship issues, and then has them through that sign up and a lottery kind of sign up for SMS messages. And again, it's trying to target some of these skills around emotional regulation, communication skills, sexual consent, and framing around financial transparency and communication, but doing it really framed around a modern man identity, and framing it in sort of positive masculinity. And so that's the other intervention that, again, we've moved through this whole iterative process with, gotten lots of feedback and engagement with men, and now we're moving this to an RCT, which again has the program just launched this weekend. And so we'll have findings again next year. And so then I wanted to just mention the third part of this initiative, which is a very different approach than this kind of designing from the user, and really is trying to broaden the research and the types of researchers who study IPV. And this is through a research fund that's actually building on, I think, the real unique position that IPA has in the field to leverage the 100 plus studies that IPA has going on, and all the large network of researchers who do studies on related topics, so on women's economic empowerment, on reproductive health, so issues that are certainly very closely related to intimate partner violence, but have not been measuring intimate partner violence as an outcome. And this part of the initiative is really trying to grow the evidence base by not starting new studies, but including additional measures on intimate partner violence with these studies. And so it's a research fund competitive research fund that researchers, both within the IPA network, but also outside of it, can apply to add IPV questions to their study or add an additional module, an additional arm of the intervention. So far, this has expanded to 9 RCTs. to include intimate partner violence as outcomes, and more of those are in the pipeline. And just to give you a picture again of the scarce evidence that did exist, this is probably slightly different now, but it represents, these 9 studies represent about a 25% increase on the total studies that were documented in the 3IE gap map. So it is a really significant push to grow the evidence base. And so just to give you a sense, so it's funded a diverse set of projects, including those that focus on mental health, labor market changes, entrepreneurial training, increasing household finances, and here are a couple of examples. So many of you are probably familiar with the ultra poor model, and so adding that there was an addition of cognitive behavioral therapy to that in Ghana. This was the program and study already, and it was adding intimate partner violence outcomes to this study. A cash transfer study, there were a couple of cash transfer studies. That's a field that has some evidence and, interestingly, mixed evidence. So some studies showing that there's an increase in intimate partner violence and some showing a decrease. So there are, Pace can correct me, but at least 2 studies on cash transfers that the IPA's funded. And then another one that's quite different is incentives for seasonal migratory work in Bangladesh that showed some strong economic findings, and so adding intimate partner violence. So that just gives you a glimpse of a couple of the studies that have been funded. So I'll stop there, and I think we're going to move to Dawn and then open it up for questions. Was that? Yes, okay.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to follow Jeannie, who's such an amazingly gifted and courageous researcher. So, and it's nice to be back at the Yale Club. I've been teaching at Columbia since 2011. For the prior 23 years, I was at Yale, and it's funny to return back to the Yale Club. I once gave a keynote address to the class of 1945. It's really true. The number 1 question was, what's it like to teach women? Okay, there you go. Yeah. So there it was. So on the subject of women, we've been doing a series of studies involving IPV in East Africa with special reference to Uganda and now in Tanzania. And I thought that I would share with you a series of findings from these RCTs and also give you a sense of the trajectory where we're headed. Feel free to interrupt with questions or comments anytime. This underlying idea is inspired by a growing literature on so-called education entertainment. This idea is based on a psychological theory that says that when people are engrossed in a dramatization, they tend to let down their guard and become open to changes in attitudes and beliefs and perhaps even behavioral proclivities through the modeling behaviors of the people they're watching in these dramatizations or listening to in the case of radio dramatizations. And when you look at the considerable literature that is now developed on entertainment education, actually the results are striking in 2 ways. First of all, the effects tend to be quite substantial, whether we're talking about ethnic reconciliation radio programs, the so-called Musekeweya program in Rwanda, a study conducted by my brilliant colleague and former student, Betsy Levy-Palak, or anti-vote buying vignettes in the context of pre-election messages in the 2014 Indian election, or health interventions about iodized salt and other kinds of things. In Nigeria, there are anti-corruption messages embedded in DVDs that were distributed, also HIV-related messages on TV. These tend to produce fairly substantial effects. By contrast, more direct, repeated information without dramatization produces incredibly disappointing results. So thinking of the Burkina Faso interventions on neonatal care, that was a complete bust. Hand washing initiatives in Asia and Latin America, that's been incredibly disappointing. And so the mere repetition of blandishments seems to be rather disappointing in terms of its outcomes. So the idea then behind our intervention is to try to leverage the magic of education and entertainment, especially in the context of Uganda, rural Uganda, where exposure to mass media tends to be fairly limited. Fewer than 15% of our villagers have access to TVs in their households. Very few have smartphones. And therefore, there would be no way for them to otherwise access this kind of media. And so the question is, how can we make a violence against women intervention scalable in a society that's very poor? And that's a rather important departure from the literature, even on violence against women research in places like Uganda, which have tended to be urban in their focus. And it's very hard to find, the density of NGOs, of local community leaders, et cetera, that would make this viable in a rural setting. So we want to do a study of mass media, and the literature on mass media interventions used to be absolutely horrible, and now it's merely on average bad. So what has changed? Well, it used to be that when you did an evaluation of some kind of media intervention, you would do it in a kind of lab setting or a lab-like setting where you show people the video and you ask them immediately afterward what they think. And so apropos of the conversation from the previous session, there's obviously priming going on. There's a real threat of socially desirable answers. And it's very hard to maintain the symmetry between treatment and control because more than one thing is going on in the treatment group. So we want to provide our interventions in a naturalistic setting because ultimately this kind of project aspires to do something that's policy relevant. It's an interesting theoretical or behavioral exercise, but primarily we want to know, as a policy, is this kind of intervention effective and is it scalable? So we want to overcome what would be in a randomized trial context a non-compliance problem. So recall that a randomized trial is a study in which the units of observation, in this case it'll be villages, are assigned at random to treatment and control. And that means that on average there should be no difference between the treatment group and the control group because essentially a coin flip determined which one was put into the treatment group. Still, when you assign groups in that way, not everybody takes the treatment in the assigned treatment group. And what we wanted to do is design a study that was placebo-controlled precisely because we wanted to make sure that we were making an apples-to-apples comparison between the people who show up to our videos in the treatment group and their essentially identical twins in the control group. So the study that I'm going to describe is going to be placebo-controlled, and moreover, it's going to be designed in a way that would enable us to assess whether there are spillover effects from exposure to mass media through person-to-person communication. When we're talking about small villages in, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, whatever, we're talking about places where there's very little movement. More than half the adults in our villages have lived there their entire adult lives. And so these are tight-knit communities, and one might imagine that messages that are deployed in the communities, especially by way of what we'll see as a film festival, might diffuse throughout the community. So we want to have an experimental design that not only can assess the effects of the treatment given noncompliance, but can also detect spillovers. And it has to be, up to my standards anyway, be unobtrusive in the sense that there shouldn't be an obvious connection between the intervention, you saw this film, and the questionnaire that's going to gauge attitudes. Because, first of all, it's lame, but secondly, it undercuts the policy relevance of whatever you do. Moreover, in contrast to the usual lab study, which almost never looks at effects one day after treatment, right? If you took this vast literature on media effects and you said, how many of these studies look at treatment effects that last at least one day, you've cut it by 90%. Okay, so in our case, we're going to come back after 2 months, and then we're going to come back again after 8 months, and we're going to put our end-line measurements in a survey that covers a wide array of different topics. It's going to cover violence against women, but it's also going to cover abortion and abortion stigma and mob violence and teacher absenteeism and yada, yada, yada. So there is no obvious connection between the focus of the survey and the videos that they happen to see. So that's sort of our opening bid. So we did 2 randomized trials, one, as I'll point out in just a minute, in 56 trading centers in rural Uganda. And then that was our pilot study, which is a pretty darn big study. And then we went to 112 villages. You might say, well, why so many villages? Well, remember, this is a cluster randomized trial. We're going to randomly assign entire villages to receive treatment or the placebo. And so although we're going to end up with more than 10,000 people viewing our videos, our effective number of observations is much smaller because, of course, these people are grouped into villages. So what are we going to do? We're going to, in 2015, do a month-long weekend film festival. In 2016, we're going to do a 6-week-long film festival. These are free films shown on weekends in video halls known in Uganda as Chibanda or Bibanda, plural. And the idea is that these are places where men ordinarily go to watch soccer or kung fu movies. And so we're going to rent these places out. We're going to invite the entire community, have a big publicity campaign, bring people out, including remember the first slide that you saw at the very beginning, lots of children are going to see a movie essentially for the first time. These are going to be feature-length Hollywood movies, so Slumdog Millionaire and Pirates of the Caribbean and blah, blah. And they're going to see free movies, and during the commercial breaks of those movies, we're going to embed our videos. And let me just say a little bit about the videos. I know I'm going very fast, but I'm going to try to keep this short so that we have time for discussion. The key thing about these videos, is that they are filmed on location. They are written by Ugandan screenwriters. Okay, so these are Ugandan actors on location in rural Uganda with Ugandan screenwriters writing them scripts about social norms, essentially, and it's going to be on these 3 topics. Very importantly, these are going to be cut into 3 vignettes. So there's essentially like a little serialized set of messages that are going to be played during the commercial breaks of these movies. So people come to the movie, but they're going to be exposed to one of these randomly assigned videos, kind of a video montage, if you like. It's very important to note that none of the Western movies are going to be dubbed into Luganda, the local language. Instead, the only thing that's going to be shown in the local language is our videos. Okay, so if you've ever seen like the Wizard of Oz, remember when Dorothy lands in Oz, all of a sudden you go from the black and white to the color, okay? This is going to be the first time that many people have ever seen a movie, but it's also going to be the first time that they've ever seen a movie in their native language with people who look like them as the actors. So in that sense, it is unusually resonant. So just kind of keep that in mind as we think about the effects. There are going to be 3 kinds of movies. They are going to either involve our treatment of interest today, the violence against women movies, or they're going to be about other topics, abortion stigma or teacher absenteeism, or some combination of those. So this is what these kinds of things look like, but there were no subtitles in our movies. So this is purely for us to be able to read about things. This is going to be an important one later on. I'll talk about it because we did the study twice, right? First in 56 villages and then in 112 villages. When we did it in 56 villages, our first movie on domestic violence, or IPV, failed utterly to change attitudes. And in fact, men, largely male audiences, about 2/3 male, heckled the movie. And I'll say more about that. This is where our experiment took place. This is round 1, so this is the 56 village study, and this is the 112 village study. Notice that we are hours outside of Kampala, so we're in an area that we quickly leave paved roads, where there's no sewage, there's no running water, there's no electricity. There essentially, there's police in principle, but if you ask, as we do in our surveys, when was the last time that you saw a police officer in your village? The median time is something like 2 weeks. So it's not as though you're walking through Manhattan. You're out in a place where the state has very limited resources, where the health facility has essentially no drugs in it. It's poor, but not desperately poor. That's what's kind of interesting about this. Uganda has very little problem with food scarcity because the country is so naturally fertile. So out there, we're not talking about people who are desperately poor, although about 40% of them have household incomes of $2 a day or less. There's very little starvation. It is, however, very important to recognize that the average rural woman in Uganda has more than 6 children. So the population pyramid of Uganda is extraordinary. So it's kind of that should be in your mind's eye as you're thinking about this this kind of thing. So our design, back to the pointy-headed nerdy stuff, our design is going to be a randomized trial in which things are going to be divided into 7 different groups. We're going to have a control in which the film festival contains no commercials, not that we do anyway. And then another set of films in which we insert commercials only on one topic. Another one where we put in 2 topics. We'd have none where we put in 3 because there just weren't that many commercial breaks. These poor listeners, they had to do it. So we would rent out these video halls, invite the entire community, indeed reserve seats for women to make sure they felt extra welcome at these places, hold the festival for 6 weeks, and essentially bring in people to watch the movies. They came for the movies, they didn't come for our commercials, obviously, and that's what creates the placebo design. Okay, so what are some other features of our design? Well, before I became a randomista, back in the 1990s, I was a survey researcher. I went to Berkeley. I was at the Survey Research Center. And all the tricks that I learned when I was a graduate student got new life when I came to Uganda because the response rate was 96%, or 98% in the 56 village study. 112 villages. We've dropped down to 96 only because in 2 villages we could not come back to do the surveys after we had done the films because there was an Illuminati scare. So people were suspected of being blood-drinking outsiders. There were no whites involved here. It's just that there was a scare, so we couldn't come into the village. But it had nothing to do with our intervention. At any rate, that's why our response rate is only 96%. But when we re-interviewed people after the 8-month follow-up, we got 90%. So we could talk to people for a good hour in our post-survey, and very often they would thank us for being interested in their views because no one had ever asked them about anything that they ever thought, which is a kind of interesting commentary, right, on public opinion research in a place that's in a semi-authoritarian regime. Public opinion isn't very important in those kinds of contexts. Okay, so how did we do this? We went to Google satellite maps. We drew maps of the community. We enumerated all the dwellings. We drew random samples of those dwellings. And so this is an unusually rigorous random sample of villagers. And again, apropos of the question from the last session, we did not focus our surveys on the people who went to the films. We did not do that. We did an entire community survey, okay? So a random survey of roughly 40 to 50 people in every village, not targeted at viewers. And that also is what allows us to look at spillover effects. So I think I've, as they say, beaten that dead horse to death. So I just want to say something about the ethical precautions that were taken. These, again, were local screenwriters, so this is not, the view from Manhattan. There were on-site focus groups at every stage in the development of these videos, including at the storyboard stage. We got input from the local NGOs who specialize in IPV. We did on-site pre-screening of the videos in a kind of lab-like setting. We also did post-intervention surveys as well as another round of focus groups, again, to see whether there were any issues, whether people found it problematic in any way. And the one thing that is delicate, and Jeannie alluded to this, is the direct questioning about IPV experiences. You don't want to re-traumatize people, and you also don't want to, especially in a context where belief in witchcraft is so widespread, let people think that others can figure out what they have said to enumerators. So these are questions about victimization that are broached only to women and only by other female interviewers. So just want to mention that. Okay, so our primary outcomes, now we're getting to this is where it gets good, okay? Our primary outcomes are going to be several. We're going to look at general attitudes about violence toward women. Bear in mind that in East Africa, you have some of the highest rates of support for IPV among the general population, not just men, but also women. So a canonical way of asking about this is, does a husband have a legitimate right to beat his wife if she, and then they give some scenarios, burns the food, fails to watch the children, disobeys, gossips in the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the rates are very, very high. More than half of men and women subscribe to the view that husbands have a legitimate right to beat their wives under at least one of those circumstances. Just for interest, I deployed those questions in the United States, and it's about 4%. So one question are these so-called cognitive attitudes, where attitudes, again, kind of in a social psychological lingo, refer to enduring predispositions to respond to a class of stimulus objects. So the question is, how do you feel about this general topic, violence against women, as opposed to so-called conative attitudes, where conation refers to your attitudes toward action. So, what would you do? Would you be helpful to a person who is the victim of violence? Would you say something helpful, give that person, helpful advice, or not? And so this is all about reporting to local authorities or authority figures in the villages. Then there's a very important set of questions about perceived social norms. Would your allegations be taken seriously? Would other people, regard this as mere gossip on your part, or would you be, treated with dignity and respect, whether you're the victim or somebody who's a helpful bystander? And then finally, the reported household incidence rate. Okay, so here are the results, and we're done. Okay, so it's very important to point out, just for starters, that we utterly failed to change attitudes about IPV, okay? So lest you think that this is just some kind of social desirability bias, let me point out all the ways in which we failed to move attitudes, okay? So number one had no effect on this general view about whether husbands have a legitimate right to beat their wives, okay? So that's unmoved here. What we do find, and it's true in the 2-month follow-up and the 8-month follow-up, is that there is a substantial change in the willingness to report. We're not saying, did you report? We're saying, would you be, what would you do in this hypothetical scenario where a cousin of yours has been battered and comes to you, and you could say something that temporizes, like things will be better, or it's a sign of love, or some such thing. Or you can, and the alternative is to do something proactive, like you could report it to the LC1 chairperson, or you could tell the in-laws, or you could tell the Nabachala, the so-called leader of the women, and so on. So there are, we're not saying that they would literally do that, but the point is that they now have a behavioral proclivity to do that, and it is a substantial increase. And again, it doesn't seem to have any obvious connection to social desirability, because there's no clear connection between our survey and the intervention, and there are lots of other null findings. But that one does move. And then more importantly, perhaps, for those of you who just care about the IPV bottom line, and of course this is very hard to measure in any objective way, when you ask women, without special reference to any particular woman, has anybody been the victim of violence, where in order to maintain symmetry between treatment and control, we're very, very clear about what constitutes violence. So this is not emotional violence. We literally come to it after a survey on crime victimization in the village, where we say, violence includes, and we give a whole bunch of things that it would include to make sure that there's nothing about the treatment that would change the standards of measurement between treatment and control. So once we sort of frame it that way, it turns out that there is a substantial change in violence. It's about an 18% reduction in terms of the share of households that experience violence. Now you might say, well, what's that all about? You didn't change attitudes. But to the extent that we change perceptions about reporting, right? A whole bunch of men and a whole bunch of women, but especially men, have now seen these videos, and there is a sense of the norms have changed about this kind of behavior, and what people might do by way of reporting has changed. And so we think that is the active mechanism. But as always, I want to see the magic again. I want to do a replication study of this. And so I'm fixing to do this in the placebo villages and the control villages. So redo it in the villages where we didn't show violence against women video, and just redo another round of this intervention. Have another film festival, and this time show half of the villages the violence against women thing. By the way, lest you think that this is just a kind of artifact of a particular video on a particular topic, it turns out that the teacher absenteeism videos and the abortion stigma videos also change cognitive attitudes. So you're now more likely to say you would help a girl in your village who has a botched abortion to get medical attention and so on, even though your views about abortion do not change at all. So again, it's kind of the distinction between cognitive and cognitive attitudes. All right, so to conclude, I think we have a workable design to assess media effects in this kind of context. And I'm very eager to essentially take this design on the road and do it across the band of East Africa. And we're sort of doing that now, but I'd like to do more of that and in a more systematic way, because these are just 3 sets of videos. And this should be a research program where we see whether we could do better than what we've got, or we've now respliced all of the videos to focus, to accentuate different kinds of messages to see whether we can amp up the treatment effects. I think that the very interesting question is, okay, we have this effect on cognitive attitudes, but what about self-reports? Can that be replicated, and to what extent is this indeed a scalable and enduring effect? By the way, just one last thing on the survey self-reports. Of course, they're self-reports, but lest you think that we were somehow priming people to think about the violence against women videos, we specifically did an 8-month follow-up, but phrased the question about, since the surveys took place in July, since Christmas, okay? Right, so they're not referring to the film festival, which happened in the fall. So again, we're trying to throw people off the scent, so they're not drawing a connection between our questions and outcomes. But still, that's what we got. Unfortunately, from a policy standpoint, the evidence on spillover was very disappointing. There was no evidence of spillover in terms of attitude shifts. Now, that may be because our messages are really kind of heavy. And maybe there would be spillovers if there were something lighthearted about anything that we had to say. But this does not appear to be the kind of thing that you bring home to your fellow villagers and talk about. And then again, I think that this should be a research program instead of a one-off study with respect to media effects. Thank you. We'll open the questions.
Sorry. So 2 questions about, can you just give us an idea of the, one is just like the tenor of the video? Was it sort of like an intense preaching, kind of like a PSA kind of a video? Or was it like, and now we'll have a 3-minute short drama? That's number 1. And number 2, when you say that spillovers, since you said you didn't deliberately sample the people who participated, the viewers, are we talking about spillovers? So are we talking about spillover, you asked them in the survey if they went, and then we're talking about people who didn't go, or do you mean spillovers to other kinds of attitudes? What do you mean?
No, both actually, but you're exactly right on the second one. Let me answer the second one first and get to the first one. So with respect to spillovers, we were able to ask people at the very end, right, since we don't want to prime them, did you go? Okay, so those were our so-called compliers, or for the next rung down, the indirect compliers are the people whose families or friends went, but who didn't go themselves. And the so-called apprised never takers are the ones who didn't go, didn't have family go or friends go, but nevertheless knew about the events. And then the people who are pure never takers are the people who had no awareness of it, didn't know anybody who went. And so we thought what we would find in the design is a kind of trickle down from level to level and find ever diminishing effects. But Actually, there's very little evidence.
So I said just the people who participated directly.
Yes, right. So the other part of the study that I didn't have time to talk about is that we had more than 10,000 attendees of these events, including a very large number of teenagers. And so in the second phase of the study, we did an oversample of teenage respondents. So this is actually the first parent-teen socialization study in all of Africa. So we are currently writing that up. But we found very faint effects of teens going and changing their parents' attitudes or parents going and changing their teens' attitudes. So that was a kind of interesting, I thought that they would come back with this message and maybe have a conversation about it. There was some evidence of it for teacher absenteeism, which might have been a more natural source of conversation between parents and children, but not so much on the other issues. Let's see, your first question.
Tenor of the video didn't.
The video, yes, of course, the video. Okay, let me tell you about both videos because they're kind of it's an interesting contrast. Okay, so in the first video, which was heavily guided by a lot of the folks who are activists in this area, it was all about prevailing social norms. So it was a story about a guy who beats his wife, who is a likable enough guy, but whose friend from Kampala tells him, what are you doing, right? He's a lawyer friend from Kampala. This is against the law. The village headman says, you're violating the law, and this is, not part of our custom. And his father-in-law says, this is stupid. You don't want to do this because it's going to, cause you all kinds of grief. So everybody around says no, and then he continues, and he's arrested and dragged away, okay? So, the message is very clear. It's immoral, it's stupid, it's illegal. It didn't work, okay? It had no effect whatsoever on anybody's anything, okay? And I think that there was tremendous resistance in the audience because our secret shopper enumerators who were there taking attendance, said that there was heckling and, among the men who were watching. So we reconfigured the films, reshot them, rewrote them, and this time it's a tale of two cities, okay? So, two villages. So we got, in village number 1, you have the no disclosure, just like don't do anything village. And it's a story about a woman who is likable enough, but given impossible demands by her abusive husband, who eventually beats her severely, and she's in the hospital and eventually dies from her injuries, okay? But everybody has a chance. The neighbor overhears her and doesn't do anything. The children, the parents, everybody is at the funeral. They're lamenting the fact that they didn't do anything or they didn't speak out to stop it before the violence spiraled out of control. And then the final scene is the other village where they're going down the exact same path, but the in-laws become involved, and they're able to get mediation from the Nabichala, and basically things are talked out and they're worked out. And so the narration is about breaking a downward spiral. So it's a totally different kind of thing. And also, I didn't have time to say this, but I meant to, is that in the first case, okay, so we're running headlong into norms that say men are allowed to do this. In the second case, what we're trying to do is leverage the norm that says that although violence is considered legitimate for its pedagogic value, excessive violence is not. So it is nevertheless true that more than a third of rural Ugandan women say that they've been beaten severely or strangled or burned or kicked, something really over the top. And we were trying to use the fact that when you talk either on a survey or just in face-to-face conversation with people, even people who say, yes, a husband has a legitimate right to beat his wife if she disobeys. You say, when you say beat, do you mean, like a slap or something more severe? Only 5% say more severe. So we're trying to leverage the fact that the norm has a kind of stopping point, and that's what the video is about. Now, interestingly, there are a whole bunch of things about the video that aren't in the video. For example, the husband he's remorseful, but he's not actually punished. Okay, so we're, you could say, well, wait a minute, what kind of thing is that teaching the community? And I think we were trying to have a soft touch on that point, to make it all driven by this kind of Bandura, psychological effect of letting down your guard and empathizing with the victim.
Yeah, John, I'm curious about if you were successful in getting women to see the films, and if there's if you had any understanding of the households where you saw the reduction, if that was through women attending or men, or if there's anything you could share about.
Yeah, about a third of the viewers are women. Of course, women are highly scheduled in their lives with 6 children, and of course, these Bibanda are not seen as a place where women would ordinarily go. So that was part of the thing that we'd like to overcome in future research. We'd like to have these film festivals in a public square or in a church or in a school or something like that. That said, the effects are especially noticeable among women who attended, households where women attended. Now you might say, oh, well, that's a sign of social desirability bias. They know that no. I think that what's kind of interesting about this is that you might think that by sitting in that village-wide audience, right, now they have a different sense of what the dominant norms are in that community. Right, so remember, these are videos that are primarily directed at men, not women. It's basically about it's trying to convey to the men a sense of what is likely to happen. Will a person who comes forward and speaks out about this be taken seriously?
Yeah, so you certainly convinced me on this edutainment sale, but then it seemed like another message you gave was like, well, even with edutainment, you can't change some of these sort of norms or beliefs on violence, but you can change these other things. So it seems like there's both the sort of medium through which the message is going, and then what the message is directed at. And you had to get both of those right to see an effect here. So I guess I'm kind of wondering how much is that you're targeting the right thing, which is this barrier of reporting and things like that, and how much is having a forum that's focused on edutainment.
This is a good point. I think that in some ways we were constrained by the format. In contrast to, say, the Musekawea radio program in Rwanda, which is a very long-running Romeo and Juliet story. It doesn't literally say Hutu and Tutsi because that's illegal, but it's so obvious that that's what it's about. We have to contain what we're going to say in 12, 13 minutes. And so I think that the ability of our entertainment to change attitudes is somewhat limited. At most, we can model changes in these kinds of cognitive things. So I'm not saying that I'm confident I can change these more fundamental attitudes, but I think that this kind of format probably leans against it.
Sure, question for Jeannie. Jeannie, obviously IRC is present in refugee camps and places where people could consume this kind of entertainment around the world. How do you think about sort of your sort of role in doing that for good, or also possibly being seen as a introducer of Western values and therefore being tainted in your ability to provide services in those communities?
Interesting question. I mean, I was thinking of all kinds of ideas as you were. I mean, I know this study, but I was, as you were presenting, thinking of all kinds of ideas of how we might use this type of approach and trying to think. I mean, IRC's in 35 countries, and I'm sure we've done some edutainment, but it's not a core part of what we do. But certainly, I think there would be lots of opportunities for it. So around intimate partner violence, I think around education, I think there are a lot of opportunities in terms of the things that we do. I wouldn't have the concern about introducing Western values, just in the sense that we are already seen as an outside actor. That said, 90% 9% of the people that work for IRC are the people from the country. And so the organization is seen, as all international NGOs are, as sort of outsiders or intervening. The staff are very accepted by the community. And I think the way that this show was done, as Dawn described, was written by local writers, acted by in local language, and so I think more so than a lot of these, right now IRC. I hope we've stopped doing this, but many NGOs have done these sort of standing in front of a flip chart and saying, whether it's about hand washing or IPV, sort of community awareness campaigns where it's very didactic. It's very sort of children. You should wash your hands, or you should. To not spread disease, or you should make sure children go to school, or you should not have gender-based violence. And even if that's by local staff, that's not very well received. People will attend, but it's just not a very engaging way to do it. It doesn't have any evidence really of effectiveness. And so I think this type of edutainment would be much more accepted and not seen as sort of from the outside if done well.
Great. So thanks, everybody, again, for coming this morning. Thank you, Jeannie and Dawn, for the presentation. Thanks a lot.